Get away from that aircraft right now, or I put you on the ground. Staff Sergeant Ethan Brooks screamed the words with his hand already drifting toward his sidearm, adrenaline slamming through his veins as he closed the distance on a bleeding, unidentified woman standing pressed against a fully armed fighter jet in the middle of a live combat scramble. She didn't run. She didn't flinch. She just turned, looked him dead in the eye, and said 4 words that shattered everything he thought he knew about that night. "That's my jet." Before this story rips your heart apart, hit subscribe and drop the city you're watching from below. The alarm hit the base like a physical blow. Not a warning, not a drill. A full-throated, teeth-rattling combat scramble klaxon that ripped through the Nevada darkness and turned 300 sleeping airmen into 300 sprinting bodies in under 90 seconds. Floodlights snapped on in sequence down the flight line, one after another, like dominoes made of fire. Ground crews poured out of the maintenance bay in half-button flight suits. Somewhere behind the hangars, a fuel truck's engine roared to life, and the whole base seemed to inhale at once, holding its breath for whatever was coming next. Staff Sergeant Ethan Brooks had been on this flight line for 6 years. He had walked this exact stretch of tarmac during storms, during false alarms, during the kind of long, boring nights where nothing happened and every minute dragged like wet concrete. He knew this base in his bones. He knew every checkpoint, every fence line, every camera blind spot because it was his job to know them. Security wasn't glamorous. Nobody wrote songs about the guy standing post at 2 in the morning. But Brooks had built his entire identity around one unshakable idea. If it happens on my line, it happens because I let it happen. And nothing happened on his line that he didn't authorize. Which was exactly why in the middle of the scramble, when he turned his flashlight toward the restricted maintenance apron and saw a figure standing far too close to a fully armed F-15 E-Strike Eagle, every instinct in his body detonated at once. "Hey," he shouted, ready moving boots slapping concrete. "You there? Step away from the aircraft." The figure didn't move. Brooks closed the distance, fast weapon, hand instinctively drifting toward his sidearm, adrenaline flooding his system the way it always did in the half second before a threat became real or became nothing. As he got closer, the floodlight above the hangar caught her fully, and what he saw made him slow just for a heartbeat before his training overrode the hesitation. A woman, mid-30s, dark hair pulled back in a rough, half-collapsed knot. Her shirt was soaked through with sweat clinging to her ribs, and there was a dark stain along her side that in the harsh light looked disturbingly like dried blood. Her face was pale, her jaw tight with pain. She was clearly trying to hide, and yet she stood with a straightness, a stillness that didn't match someone who had wandered onto a military base by accident. She had one hand resting flat against the fuselage of the jet, not gripping it, not searching it, resting on it the way you'd rest your hand on the shoulder of someone you loved. "Ma'am, I need you to step back from that aircraft immediately," Brooks said, voice hard official, the voice he used when there was no room for negotiation. "This is a restricted area. You do not have clearance to be here." She turned her head toward him slowly, and for the first time he saw her eyes, and something in them made the back of his neck prickle. There was no confusion in them, no fear, no panic of a lost civilian who'd wandered somewhere she shouldn't be. There was exhaustion, yes, and pain clearly, but underneath it, command. Ownership, the kind of quiet certainty Brooks had only ever seen in senior officers who had spent decades earning the right to be unshaken. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. Brooks's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, this isn't a request. Step away from the aircraft, now." "You don't understand," she said, and her hand pressed flatter against the metal, almost protective. "That's my jet." The words landed strange, too calm, too certain. Brooks had heard every kind of excuse in 6 years of flight line security, lost tourists, drunk airmen, a reporter once who tried to sneak past the perimeter with a press badge that turned out to be laminated construction paper. But he had never heard someone say 4 words with that particular weight, like a fact so obvious it didn't need defending. "I don't know who you are," Brooks said, "and I don't care what you think you know about this aircraft. Show me ID, now." "I don't have it on me." "Then you need to come with me." "I can't do that either." Brooks felt his patience, already thin from the chaos of the scramble alarm still screaming somewhere behind them, start to fray at the edges. "Ma'am, I am not going to ask you again." For the first time, something flickered across her face. Not defiance, something closer to grief. "You're doing your job. she said quietly. I understand that, I really do. But right now that jet is the only thing standing between a unit of soldiers and a very bad night, and I need you to trust me for the next 4 minutes, because after that, none of this is going to matter. Brooks stared at her. Every part of his training told him this was manipulation, the kind of confident, specific-sounding language people use to talk their way past security. And yet something about the way she said it, the way her voice cracked slightly on the word trust, made him hesitate for a full second longer than protocol allowed. Then his radio crackled. Perimeter 2 report. Brooks keyed his mic without taking his eyes off her. Perimeter 2, I've got an unauthorized individual at the maintenance apron in direct contact with restricted aircraft, no ID, refusing to comply, requesting immediate backup. Copy Perimeter 2, backup en route. The woman closed her eyes briefly when she heard that, not in relief, but in something that looked almost like resignation, like she'd expected this exact outcome and was bracing herself to fight through it anyway. You're making a mistake, she said. I'm doing my job, Brooks answered, and for a moment the two of them just stood there, locked in a silence that neither one of them was willing to break first. That silence lasted exactly 11 seconds. Then the sound of running boots broke it 3 sets fast, closing in from the direction of the hangar. Brooks turned slightly, keeping the woman in his peripheral vision, and saw Airman Reyes and Airman Castillo flanking a third figure who moved with the unmistakable weight of experience. Crew Chief Sergeant First Class David Miller, grease-streaked flight cap, crooked clearly yanked straight out of pre-flight prep. Brooks, what's the situation? Miller started, and then he stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes locked onto the woman, and every ounce of urgency in his face rearranged itself into something Brooks had never seen from Miller in 3 years of working alongside him: shock, disbelief, and underneath it, something that looked dangerously close to relief. Captain Reeves, Miller said, and his voice cracked on the name. The woman's shoulders sagged slightly, as if she'd been holding herself rigid through sheer will, and Miller's recognition had finally given her permission to feel the pain she'd been suppressing. Hey, Dave, she said, softer now, almost apologetic. Brooks's head snapped toward Miller. You know her. Know her. Miller's voice climbed half an octave. Brooks, that's Captain Avery Reeves. She's the assigned pilot for NIGHTHAWK. I've prepped this exact aircraft for her a dozen times. That's impossible, Brooks said flatly. I pulled the active roster before shift change. There's no Captain Reeves listed as active on this base. I don't care what the roster says, Miller shot back, already moving closer to her, scanning the blood at her side with growing alarm. I'm telling you what I know. This is her jet. Avery let out a short, pained breath that might have been a laugh under different circumstances. The roster's wrong, she said. Or outdated. It's complicated. Complicated, Brooks repeated, disbelief hardening his voice. You're bleeding. You have no identification, and you're standing next to a fully armed aircraft in the middle of a base-wide scramble, and you want me to believe it's complicated is a good enough explanation. I don't need you to believe me, Avery said, meeting his eyes directly. I need 4 minutes and a working radio to command. That's not how this works. I know how it works, she snapped, and for the first time, real frustration broke through her calm. I've spent 6 years living exactly how this works. Chain of command protocol verification. I wrote half the checklist your squadron uses for weapons load verification on this exact airframe. Ask me anything. Ask me about the intake inspection variance from 18 months ago. Ask me about the debris report from the eastern runway last spring. Ask me why this jet's radar cross-section profile runs 0.2 degrees off spec on the starboard intake, and why maintenance logged it as acceptable tolerance instead of flagging it for review. Silence. Brooks felt something shift in his chest, a small, cold crack in the wall of certainty he'd built the moment he saw her. Because civilians didn't talk like that, trespassers didn't talk like that. People faking their way onto a military base didn't know obscure maintenance variances buried 3 layers deep in classified logs. Miller, standing beside him, had gone very quiet, staring at Avery with something between awe and fear. She's right about the intake variance, Miller said slowly. That's not public information. That's not even something most of the squadron knows. Brooks's jaw tightened. That doesn't mean she has clearance to be standing next to a live aircraft during a scramble. No, Avery said, but it means I'm not lying to you. Before Brooks could respond, the base-wide comm system crackled overhead, and a voice tight, urgent, edged with the particular strain of someone relaying information they didn't want to be relaying, cut through the noise of the flight line. All personnel, this is command. We have a confirmed emergency. Repeat, confirmed emergency. Ground unit call sign Timber 6 is pinned down in the Northern Canyon corridor, sustaining heavy enemy fire. Mobile SAM threat confirmed active. Immediate air support required. All available combat-ready aircraft stand by for tasking. The words hit the flight line like a physical shockwave. Brooks felt his stomach drop. Around them, the base didn't just move faster. It changed entirely, transformed from organized chaos into something with teeth. Ground crews sprinted toward aircraft. Pilots who had been running toward the ready room suddenly reversed direction toward their assigned jets. Somewhere in the distance, an engine roared to life, then another, the sound rolling across the tarmac like thunder finding its rhythm. And Avery, pale, bleeding, exhausted, Avery went rigid the instant she heard the call sign. Timber 6, she whispered, and something in her face cracked open, raw and immediate. That's Delgado's unit. Brooks stared at her. You know that unit? I flew close air support for them 11 days ago, she said, and her voice had changed completely. How? Gone was the careful calm, replaced by something urgent, almost desperate. That corridor has 3 blind approach angles and a SAM emplacement pattern that shifts every 72 hours. I know exactly where they're hiding because I mapped it myself. If whoever gets tasked with this doesn't know that pattern, they're going to fly straight into a kill box. That's not your problem right now, Brooks said, even as doubt gnawed harder at his certainty. It's everyone's problem right now, Avery shot back, because in about 90 seconds, command is going to task an aircraft for that mission. And if it's not Nighthawk, if it's not me, people are going to who don't have to. You're not medically cleared to fly anything, Brooks said. Look at you, you can barely stand. I don't need to be comfortable, she said. I need to be in that cockpit. Miller stepped between them, suddenly radio in hand, face pale. Guys, listen. He turned up the volume on his handheld, and command's voice bled through again, tighter now, more urgent. Repeat, Timber 6 requesting immediate danger, close air support. Enemy forces advancing on fixed position. All squadron leads report aircraft status immediately. A pause. Then from somewhere on base comms, a different voice clipped, authoritative, unmistakably senior, cut through. This is Major Harding. I need eyes on available airframes right now. What do we have combat ready in the next 6 minutes? Silence stretched across the radio for 2 agonizing seconds. Then a response came, and Brooks felt the ground shift beneath him. Sir, Nighthawk is fueled, armed, and pre-flighted, but we don't have a pilot of record listed as active for that airframe tonight. Avery closed her eyes. Brooks watched her face in that moment, and something about her expression, not fear, not desperation, but a kind of aching, exhausted resolve, hit him harder than anything she'd said so far. They don't know I'm here, she said quietly, almost to herself. Nobody logged me back in. Back in from where? Brooks demanded. She opened her eyes and looked at him, and for the first time he saw something underneath the exhaustion, something like fear, not for herself, but for the men pinned down 70 miles north. Recovery, she said simply. I got pulled out 11 days ago, injured. I wasn't supposed to be anywhere near this base tonight, but when I heard the emergency broadcast on my drive back through processing, she stopped, swallowed hard. I couldn't just sit there, not knowing what I know about that corridor. Brooks stared at her, and for the first time the pieces started rearranging themselves into a shape he didn't want to look directly at. You're telling me, he said slowly, that you drove yourself onto a restricted military installation injured off the books because you thought you might be needed. I'm telling you, Avery said, voice steady despite the tremor of pain underneath it, that I know that canyon better than anyone alive right now. And if command tasks a pilot who doesn't know where those SAM sites move to, they're not flying a rescue mission. They're flying a funeral. The comms crackled again. Major Harding, this is Ops. We have no other airframe with the correct weapons configuration and updated intel package for that corridor. Nighthawk is the only viable option, but pilot status is unconfirmed. A long pause. Then Harding's voice tighter now, almost frustrated. Then find me a pilot. I don't care who it is. Timber 6 does not have time for paperwork. Avery's eyes snapped up toward the hangar speakers, and something in her posture changed completely. The exhaustion didn't vanish, but it was suddenly overridden by something fiercer, something that looked almost like relief mixed with dread. "That's my window," she said. "No," Brooks said, immediately stepping in front of her, instinctively, some protective instinct rising up even through his suspicion. "You are not climbing into that cockpit. You're injured. You have no active clearance. I don't care what you know about that canyon. This isn't your call to make." "It's not yours either," Avery said, and there was no anger in it, just brutal, simple truth. "It's commands, and they need to know I'm standing right here, right now, ready to fly before they send someone in blind." Brooks hesitated. Every rule he had ever followed screamed at him to escort her off this flight line immediately, to treat her exactly like the security threat she still technically was on paper. But every second he stood there arguing was a second that mattered less to him and more to a group of soldiers he would never meet, pinned down in a canyon under fire neither of them could see. Miller broke the silence first. "Brooks," he said quietly, "I've known you 3 years. I've never once seen you break protocol. But I need you to hear me on this. I've prepped this jet with this pilot more times than I can count. Everything she's said checks out. The intake variants, the debris report, all of it. If she's lying, she's the most well-informed liar I've ever met. And if she's telling the truth..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Brooks looked at Avery. Really looked at her, past the blood, past the exhaustion, past the missing UID that his entire training told him should have ended this conversation 4 minutes ago. "If I let you near that radio," he said slowly, "and you're wrong about any of this." "I'm not wrong," Avery said, and there was no arrogance in it, only certainty forged from something that sounded a lot like grief. "I flew that corridor 16 times. I know it the way you know the perimeter of this base. Please, let me talk to command. That's all I'm asking. Not access to the jet, not clearance, just 5 seconds on a radio." Brooks stood frozen for one more heartbeat, caught between 6 years of discipline and something new clawing up from underneath it, the terrifying possibility that just this once protocol might be the thing standing between survival and disaster. Then jaw tight, he keyed his radio. "Command, this is Perimeter 2. I have a situation at the maintenance apron you need to hear directly." There was a pause, static crackling, and then Major Harding's voice cut through sharp with impatience. "Perimeter 2, make it fast. We are in the middle of an active tasking crisis." Brooks looked at Avery one last time at the blood, the pain, the impossible steadiness in her eyes, and made a decision that would haunt or vindicate him for the rest of his career. "Sir," he said, "I have a woman here claiming to be Captain Avery Reeves, assigned pilot of NIGHTHAWK. She says she has current intel on the SAM patterns in the northern corridor. She's injured unlisted on the active roster, but Crew Chief Miller has positively identified her, and she's demonstrated detailed operational knowledge consistent with her claim." Silence stretched on the other end of the radio long enough that Brooks wondered if the transmission had dropped. Then Harding's voice came back, low, urgent, and utterly transformed. "Say that name again." "Captain Avery Reeves, sir." Another pause, then quieter almost to himself. "Reeves is supposed to be in recovery 140 miles from here. She says she came back the moment she heard the broadcast, sir." A long breath crackled over the radio. "Put her on." Brooks lowered the handset toward Avery, hand trembling slightly. Adrenaline and disbelief tangled together in his chest. She took it with a hand that wasn't entirely steady either, pressed it to her ear and closed her eyes for one brief second before she spoke. "Major Harding," she said, voice steadier than Brooks had heard it all night. "This is Captain Reeves. I know I'm not supposed to be here, but I know that canyon, and right now that matters more than paperwork." There was a pause on the other end, and in that silence the entire flight line seemed to hold its breath, along with her Brooks Miller, the 2 airmen, standing frozen nearby, all of them, waiting on the answer to a question none of them had expected to matter this much. Then Harding's voice came through, hard, urgent, decisive in a way that made the hair on Brooks's arms stand up. "Reeves talked to me about that SAM pattern. Right now, fast." And Avery Reeves, blood-soaked, exhausted, standing on a flight line she had no legal right to be on, began speaking with a precision and certainty that made every doubt in Brooks's mind collapse in real time. Coordinates, elevation changes, engagement, windows, the exact rhythm of enemy repositioning she had memorized under fire 11 days earlier. Brooks stood there, radio silent now, in his own hand, watching the impossible unfold in front of him, and felt something shift permanently in his understanding of what tonight actually was. because this wasn't a security breach. This was a woman fighting to get back into the fight before command even understood what was at stake. And somewhere 70 miles north, the unit of soldiers had no idea that the only person who might save them had just walked straight through the one man trained to stop her. The radio went quiet for 3 full seconds after Avery finished speaking. And in those 3 seconds, Brooks felt something he hadn't expected to feel standing on his own flight line, small, irrelevant, like a man who had just watched a storm walk past him and only now understood how close he'd come to standing directly in its path. Then Harding's voice cracked back through the handset, and it wasn't the voice of a man asking questions anymore. It was the voice of a man making decisions. Reeves, say your last transmission, again coordinates only, and confirm elevation on that third SAM position. Avery didn't hesitate. She rattled off the numbers like they'd been carved into her long before tonight, before the injury, before the recovery ward, before any of this. Brooks watched her lips move and realized he was holding his breath without meaning to. "Copy," Harding said. "Stand by." The line went dead again, and this time the silence stretched longer, heavier, thick enough that Brooks could hear his own pulse in his ears over the distant scream of engines spinning up somewhere down the flight line. Avery lowered the radio slightly, her hand trembling now. Not from fear, Brooks realized, but from sheer physical exhaustion finally catching up to her. She swayed for half a second, caught herself against the fuselage, and Miller was at her side instantly, one hand hovering near her elbow, like he wasn't sure if touching her would help or hurt. "Easy," Miller murmured. "You're still bleeding, Cap." "I'm fine," she said, the same automatic response Brooks was starting to suspect she gave to everything, whether it was true or not. "You're not fine," Brooks said, and it came out harder than he intended, edged with something that surprised even him. Not suspicion anymore, but something closer to concern. "You look like you're about to pass out." "I don't have time to pass out. That's not really how bodies work." For the first time all night, something flickered across her face that wasn't pain or urgency. It was almost a smile, thin and exhausted, gone as fast as it appeared. You'd be surprised what a body can do when it doesn't have a choice. Before Brooks could respond, the radio crackled back to life, and this time the voice on the other end wasn't Harding's. It was older, slower, carrying the particular gravity of someone who had spent 30 years learning exactly how much weight his words needed before he said them. "This is Colonel Hale. Patch me through to the individual identifying as Captain Reeves." Avery's spine straightened instantly, pain forgotten, for a moment replaced by pure reflex, the muscle memory of a soldier hearing a name that mattered. "This is Reeves, sir," Captain Harrell said, and there was no warmth in it, no softness, just the flat measuring tone of a man about to decide something enormous. "You are currently absent without authorization from a medical recovery facility on my base, uninvited near a live aircraft during an active combat tasking. Do you understand how many rules you have broken in the last 20 minutes? "Yes, sir." "Do you understand what happens to officers who violate medical hold status during active operations?" "Yes, sir." "And you came anyway." It wasn't a question. Avery answered it like one anyway. "Yes, sir, because Timber 6 doesn't have 20 minutes for me to explain myself, and I couldn't live with sitting in a recovery bed knowing I had the one piece of information that could save them." Silence again. Brooks found himself leaning in slightly as if proximity to the radio could somehow influence what came out of it next. "Major Harding tells me your intel checks against the last confirmed reconnaissance pass," Hale said finally, "which is either the most remarkable coincidence I have witnessed in 28 years of service, or you actually know what you're talking about." "I know what I'm talking about, sir." "Convince me." And Avery did. She spoke for the next 90 seconds without a single pause, without a single stumble, laying out the corridor terrain like she was reading it off a map, burned permanently into the inside of her skull. Elevation changes that funneled aircraft into predictable approach lanes, a ridgeline that created a radar shadow the enemy had learned to exploit. The specific rotation pattern of the mobile SAM unit that shifted position every 72 hours based on a supply route she'd tracked personally during 3 prior missions. She talked about Timber 6's exact grid reference, about the 2 extraction routes that were viable and the one that would get everyone killed, about the 12-second window during final approach, where an aircraft would be most exposed and least protected. Brooks stood there listening, and something in his chest tightened with a feeling he didn't have a name for yet, awe maybe, or something colder, something closer to dread, because every word she said made it more and more impossible to believe she was anything other than exactly who she claimed to be. When she finished, there was a pause on the other end that felt like it lasted an hour. Captain Hale said finally, "You are still medically grounded. That has not changed. I have a flight surgeon's report on my desk from 11 days ago that says you have 3 cracked ribs, a grade 2 concussion, and clearance for 0 flight duty for the next 30 days minimum." "I'm aware of my own injuries, sir." "Then you're also aware that putting you in that cockpit could kill you before the enemy gets the chance." "I'm aware of that too. And you're asking me to authorize it anyway." Avery closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, there was something raw in her expression that made Brooks look away instinctively, like he'd stumbled into something too private for a flight line radio conversation. "Sir," she said, voice steady despite everything underneath it, "I'm not asking you to authorize anything for my sake. I'm telling you that right now, tonight, in this window, I am the only pilot on this base who has flown that exact corridor 16 times, who knows the SAM rotation without needing a briefing packet, who can get in, suppress those targets, and get Timber 6 out alive. Every minute we spend deciding is a minute those men don't have. If you send someone else in without this intel, you're not sending a rescue, you're sending a coin flip." The radio went silent. Brooks realized his hands had curled into fists at his sides without him noticing, nails digging into his palms, every muscle in his body locked tight with the unbearable tension of waiting on a decision that wasn't his to make, but somehow felt like it belonged to all of them now. Miller shifted beside him, voice barely above a whisper. "She's not wrong, Brooks. I've flown ground support for enough of these missions to know nobody memorizes a corridor like that unless they've bled in it." "That's what worries me," Brooks muttered. Then Hale's voice came back, and something about the tone had shifted heavier, now the sound of a man carrying the weight of a decision he knew he'd have to live with either way. "Major Harding." Sir Harding's voice answered immediately, tense waiting. "Status on Timber 6? "Deteriorating, sir. They report increased volume of fire in the last 90 seconds. Estimated time before position becomes untenable 12 minutes, maybe less." 12 minutes. The words hit the flight line like a physical weight, and Brooks watched Avery's face when she heard them, watched the exhaustion and pain briefly vanish behind something fierce and unbreakable. The look of a person who had just heard a clock start ticking and refused to let it beat her. "Sir," she said before Hale could speak again, 12 minutes is enough time. I can be airborne in 4. "You can barely stand upright, Captain." "I don't need to stand upright to fly. I need to sit in a cockpit and pull a trigger at the right coordinates. My legs aren't the problem tonight." A long breath crackled over the radio, and Brooks could almost picture the man on the other end, gray-haired, exhausted, carrying 28 years of decisions just like this one, standing somewhere in a command center, staring at a map with red markers creeping closer to a unit of soldiers he'd probably never met, but felt responsible for anyway. "If I clear you," Hale said slowly, "and something happens to you mid-flight because your body gives out before your judgment does, that is on me. Do you understand that I will have signed off on sending an injured pilot into a combat zone against direct medical orders?" "I understand, sir. And if you fly this mission and it goes wrong, there will be no room afterward for me to explain that away as anything other than exactly what it is." "I understand that too, sir." Hale exhaled long and heavy, the sound of a man setting something down that he'd been carrying too long. "Why you, Captain, truly, convince me one more time, because I need to hear it clean. Not adrenaline, not desperation, the actual reason." Avery didn't answer it immediately. For a moment, Brooks thought she might not answer at all, that the question had finally found the one crack in her composure that nothing else had managed to reach. When she did speak, her voice was quieter than it had been all night, stripped down to something almost unbearably honest. "Because 11 days ago, I flew close air support for Timber 6, and I watched 2 of their men go down before we could get eyes on the shooters. I remember every second of that mission, sir. I remember the terrain because I studied it for 6 hours before that flight, and I haven't stopped thinking about it since. If there's any version of tonight where those men make it home, and I wasn't the one in that cockpit, I don't think I survive, knowing I was standing on this base capable, and let someone else take that risk without the information I had. This isn't heroic, sir. This is just..." She paused, swallowing hard. "This is just refusing to let today be another version of 11 days ago." Silence. Brooks felt something shift in his own chest. Something he didn't examine too closely, because examining it meant admitting how completely his certainty from 20 minutes ago had crumbled into something else entirely. Then Hale spoke, and his voice had changed one final time, decisive now, final, the sound of a decision fully made. Medical hold is overridden, effective immediately under my direct authority. Captain Avery Reeves is cleared for flight status, single mission, Nighthawk aircraft target package as briefed. Major Harding get her suited and airborne in 4 minutes. God help all of us if this goes wrong. Copy, sir, Harding said, and Brooks could hear the tension bleeding out of his voice into something like desperate hope. Perimeter 2, release the aircraft and the pilot immediately. Ground crew initiate rapid pre-flight. Now we do not have time to waste. The transmission cut out, and for one full second, nobody on the flight line moved. Then everything exploded into motion at once. Miller was already turning shouting orders toward the maintenance crew gathering near the hangar voice, cutting through the chaos with the practiced authority of a man who had run 1,000 pre-flight sequences and had never once done it under this kind of pressure. Airmen sprinted toward equipment lockers. Somewhere behind them, a fuel truck reversed with a warning beep that seemed absurdly calm compared to everything happening around it. And Avery straightened up, and something changed in her posture, something Brooks would think about for years afterward. The exhaustion didn't disappear. The pain didn't disappear. But something underneath both of those things rose up and took command of her body, transformed her from a woman barely able to stand into someone who moved like the aircraft beside her was an extension of her own will. I need a flight suit, she said, already moving toward the equipment cart Miller was wheeling over. And someone get me a headset, mine's still logged out from 11 days ago. On it, Miller called back, already tossing gear toward her. Brooks stood frozen for a moment, watching all of it unfold, feeling like a man who had wandered into a movie halfway through and was only now understanding the stakes of the scene he'd already been standing in. Then his training kicked back in and he moved too, not to stop her this time, but because some instinct told him this was a moment he needed to be close to whatever it turned into. You're really doing this, he said, stepping toward her as she pulled the flight suit over her sweat-soaked shirt, wincing hard enough that Brooks saw her hand twitch involuntarily toward her ribs before she forced it back to the zipper. I'm really doing this, she confirmed, not looking up. 20 minutes ago, I was trying to arrest you. 20 minutes ago, you were doing exactly what you were supposed to do, she said, finally meeting his eyes. Don't apologize for that. If the roles were reversed, I'd have wanted you to stop me too. The system's supposed to work that way. Tonight, it just didn't have all the information yet. Brooks didn't know what to say to that, so he said the only thing that felt true. You should have been in a hospital bed. Maybe, she said, tightening a strap across her shoulder with a wince. But there's a version of tonight where I'm lying in that hospital bed listening to a news report about Timber 6 getting overrun because nobody knew where those SAM positions moved to, and I don't think I could live in that version. I don't think I could live with myself at all. The words hit harder than Brooks expected, and for a moment he found himself looking at her differently. Not as a security threat, not as an impossible anomaly on a roster, but as a person who had made a choice most people would never have to make and had made it without hesitation. 60 seconds, Miller shouted from beside the aircraft, voice tight with urgency. Cap, we need you in that cockpit now. Avery nodded, moving toward the boarding ladder, despite the visible effort it cost her every step. A small negotiation with pain. Her body clearly wanted her to acknowledge, and she clearly refused to give into. Brooks watched her hand grip the ladder rail, watched her knuckles go white, watched her jaw clench as she forced her weight up the first rung. Wait, Brooks said, suddenly surprising himself. Avery paused, glancing back at him. Why'd you tell me the truth back there, he asked. When I stopped you. You could have lied, made up a story that sounded more official. Instead, you told me you snuck off a recovery ward. That's not exactly the smartest way to talk your way past base security. For a moment, something almost gentle crossed her face, exhaustion and pain briefly making room for something quieter underneath. Because you were doing your job right, she said. Lying to someone who's doing their job right just makes the whole system worse. I needed you to believe me because it was true, not because I tricked you into it. If I talked my way past you with a good enough lie, and something like this ever happened again, you might hesitate next time when it actually mattered. I couldn't do that to you, or to whoever comes after you. Brooks stood there, absorbing that feeling. Something settled into place inside him that he suspected would stay there for a long time. 30 seconds, Miller called, more urgent now. Avery climbed the rest of the ladder movements sharper now, pain visibly pushed somewhere deep enough not to interfere, and settled into the cockpit with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times before, injury or not. Ground crew swarmed the aircraft in a final blur of motion, checking connections, verifying weapons load, running through the abbreviated pre-flight sequence with the kind of controlled urgency that came from years of training, meeting a moment that mattered. Brooks stepped back from the aircraft, watching the canopy begin to lower, watching Avery's face disappear behind the glass, replaced by the dim glow of instrument panels and the reflected shimmer of floodlights across the cockpit glass. Miller appeared beside him, breathing hard, adrenaline still coursing visibly through him. "You all right?" "No," Brooks admitted. "I don't think I am. 20 minutes ago, you were ready to put her in restraints." 20 minutes ago, I didn't know any of this," Brooks said, eyes fixed on the aircraft as the engines began their rising whine, a sound that started low and grew until it seemed to vibrate up through the concrete beneath their boots. "How does something like this happen, Dave? How does a pilot end up standing on a flight line, unlisted, unauthorized, bleeding, and somehow still the only person who can save an entire unit?" Miller shook his head slowly. "Sometimes the system's built for a world where everything happens the way it's supposed to. Rosters get updated on time. Injuries heal on schedule. Nobody breaks protocol because protocol never has a reason to be broken." He paused, watching the aircraft's navigation lights blink on one by one. "And then a night like this happens and you realize the system was never built for people like her." The engines climbed higher, a physical roar now that Brooks felt in his chest more than heard with his ears. Ground crew backed away from the aircraft in a final coordinated retreat, hand signals flashing between them in the practiced language of people who had done this 1,000 times, though never quite like this. Brooks's radio crackled again. "Perimeter 2, this is command. Status on the aircraft." Brooks keyed his mic, eyes never leaving the jet. "NIGHTHAWK is fueled, armed, and pilot is in position. Ground crew clearing now. Estimate airborne in under 2 minutes." "Copy that," came the reply, tension audible even through the static. "Timber 6 reports enemy forces closing to within 200 meters of their position. Tell your pilot Godspeed." Brooks lowered the radio slowly, the weight of those words settling into his stomach like a stone. 200 meters. He didn't know exactly what that meant in the practical language of ground combat, but he understood enough to know it meant time had nearly run out, that the 12-minute window Harding had mentioned earlier had shrunk down to something far more brutal, and that everything now depended on an injured woman in a cockpit who shouldn't have been anywhere near this base tonight. The aircraft began to move, slowly at first, taxiing forward under Avery's control, the jet's nose light cutting through the darkness like a blade engine, screaming louder with every passing second. Brooks watched it roll toward the runway, watched the ground crew scatter to safe distances, watched Miller beside him mutter something under his breath that might have been a prayer. "You really think she can pull this off?" Brooks asked, voice barely audible over the rising engine noise. Miller didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quiet, certain, carrying the weight of years working alongside pilots who had earned every ounce of trust the ground crew placed in them. "I think if anyone can," he said, "it's her. But I also think we're about to find out just how much a person's willing to survive when giving up isn't an option." The jet reached the runway threshold and stopped, an engines idling at a pitch that seemed to shake the air itself. For one brief moment, everything went still. The base, the flight line, the entire installation holding its breath in unison, waiting for the final command that would send an injured pilot and an aircraft named NIGHTHAWK hurtling toward a fight 70 miles north where lives were being measured in seconds. Brooks's radio crackled one final time. "NIGHTHAWK, this is Tower. You are cleared for immediate takeoff. Godspeed, Captain." And in the cockpit, barely visible through the canopy glass, Brooks saw Avery's hand move toward the throttle, saw her head tilt forward slightly in what might have been focus or might have been a final silent breath before everything changed, and he realized standing there on the flight line he had sworn to protect at all costs that he was no longer watching a security situation. He was watching someone about to become exactly what the entire base needed her to be, whether her body was ready for it or not. The engines roared to a pitch that swallowed every other sound on the base, and the aircraft began to move. The jet broke ground at exactly 02:47 hours, and Brooks felt the sound of it in his teeth before he felt it in his ears, a full-throated roar that peeled off the runway and climbed into the black Nevada sky like something being flung rather than flown. He stood there with his neck craned back, watching the twin flare of the afterburners shrink into a moving star, and for the first time all night, he let himself say out loud what he'd been thinking for the last 10 minutes. God help her. Beside him, Miller didn't answer right away. He was still watching the sky too, arms crossed tight against his chest, the posture of a man trying to hold himself together through sheer physical pressure. She's flown worse, he finally said. Doesn't mean this isn't going to be close. Brooks's radio crackled, and Harding's voice came through, clipped and fast, the sound of a man managing 6 things at once. All ground personnel, Nighthawk is airborne en route to target corridor ETA 6 minutes. Command is patching cockpit audio to the operations floor. Anyone who doesn't need to be on this channel, clear it now. Brooks didn't clear it, neither did Miller. Neither, it seemed, did anyone else on that flight line, because within seconds, a small crowd had gathered near the hangar entrance. Airmen and ground crew alike, all of them drawn toward the same low murmur of static, like moths toward the only light left burning. 6 minutes. Brooks did the math without meaning to. 6 minutes of flight time stacked on top of however many minutes Timber 6 had left before their position became, in Harding's earlier words, untenable. He didn't like the shape those numbers made when he put them next to each other. Neither, apparently, did the men on the ground 70 miles north. The first voice that broke through the cockpit feed wasn't Avery's. It was rougher, breathless, edged with the particular strain of someone speaking between bursts of gunfire. Any station, this is Timber 6 Actual. We are danger close. Repeat, danger close. Enemy elements within 150 meters, enclosing, requesting immediate air support, over. Brooks felt his stomach drop. 150 meters. Somewhere in the last 90 seconds, the number had shrunk again, and it kept shrinking, and there was nothing anyone on this flight line could do about it, except stand there and listen, and hope that 6 minutes wasn't a lie the clock was telling them. Then Avery's voice cut through, and something about hearing it steady, controlled, utterly transformed from the exhausted, blood-streaked old woman who'd been standing on the tarmac 20 minutes earlier, sent a ripple through the small crowd gathered near the hangar. Timber 6 Actual, this is Nighthawk. I have your position. I am inbound, 4 minutes out. I need you to confirm your exact grid and mark your position with smoke the moment I call 90 seconds. Copy, Nighthawk. We'll mark on your call, but I gotta be honest with you, we don't have 4 minutes of cushion here. We've got maybe 2 before they're on top of us. Silence on the line for half a second, just long enough for Brooks to imagine with painful clarity what that silence must have felt like in the cockpit at whatever altitude Avery was screaming through the dark at. Copy that, Timber 6, she said, and her voice hadn't cracked, hadn't wavered, but something in the pacing of her words had changed, tightened, like a person recalculating everything in real time. I'm going to push this faster than I should. Hold what you've got. I am coming. Miller exhaled hard beside Brooks. She just told them she's pushing past safe parameters. What does that mean? Brooks asked, already half afraid of the answer. It means she's flying that airframe harder than it's rated for in these conditions, Miller said quietly. Fuel burn, structural stress, all of it. She's trading margin for time. Is that dangerous? Miller looked at him, and for the first time all night, Brooks saw real fear in the crew chief's face. Everything about tonight is dangerous, Brooks. The question is whether it's dangerous enough to matter before she gets there. The radio crackled again, and this time it was Harding's voice, tense, relaying updates from somewhere inside the operations center where screens full of moving symbols were tracking a battle none of them could actually see. Nighthawk Command, be advised, we're picking up radar indications consistent with mobile SAM activation near your projected flight path. Recommend altitude adjustment, over. There was a pause, brief but long enough that Brooks felt his pulse spike in the silence. Copy, Command, Avery said. I see it. That's exactly where I told you it'd be. I'm adjusting now. Confirm you have a visual on the threat. Negative visual radar warning only, but I know this system's rotation pattern, and I know it just repositioned to cover the exact approach I would have used 11 days ago. They learned. I'm not giving them the same mistake twice. Brooks glanced at Miller. She predicted that. She told Hale about it before she ever left the ground. Miller murmured something like awe creeping into his voice despite the tension. She said the SAM rotation shifted every 72 hours. If she's right about where it moved, then she's flying into exactly what she said she'd fly into. Brooks finished, except now it's real instead of a theory. The cockpit feed crackled with new tension. The sound of increased engine noise of something in Avery's breathing shifting into a controlled, deliberate rhythm that Brooks recognized instinctively as a person managing pain through sheer force of will. 90 seconds to target area, she said. Timber 6, mark your position now. Copy, marking now, purple smoke, purple smoke. A pause tighter than before. I have your smoke, Avery said. I have eyes on the tree line to your north. That's where the volume of fires coming from. Is that consistent with your position? Affirmative, Nighthawk. That's them. That's exactly them. They've got at least 2 firing positions dug in along that ridge. Copy. I'm going to make a low pass first to confirm targeting before I commit ordnance. I need you to keep your heads down. This is going to get loud. Brooks felt his chest tighten. A low pass flying close enough over an active firefight to visually confirm a target before dropping anything on it. Even to someone who had never sat in a cockpit, the phrase sounded like exactly what it was. The single most dangerous 4 seconds of the entire mission, a moment where the aircraft would be at its most exposed and the pilot would have the least margin to react to anything going wrong. She's putting herself in the crosshairs on purpose, Brooks said quietly. Miller nodded, jaw tight. That's the job. That's always been the job. The radio went quiet except for the rush of engine noise and the distant muffled crack of gunfire bleeding through Timber 6's open channel. Brooks found himself holding his breath again, the same way he had when the aircraft first lifted off the runway, as if his own stillness could somehow steady whatever was happening 70 miles away. Then Avery's voice came back tighter now, faster. I have visual confirmation. 2 firing positions, ridgeline exactly as briefed. Timber 6, I am rolling in hot danger close. Say again, danger close. Keep your heads down. Copy. Nighthawk cleared hot. We are down. We are down. What followed wasn't words. It was sound, a violent tearing roar that crackled through the cockpit feed and out across the flight line, speaker to the unmistakable signature of an aircraft unloading everything it had onto a fixed position at terrifying speed. Brooks felt the small crowd around him go completely still. Every face turned toward the radio, like it was the only thing left in the world worth looking at. Then silence. 2 seconds. 3. 4. Timber 6, this is Nighthawk, say status. Nothing. Brooks felt his stomach twist into something cold and hard. Beside him, Miller's hand had gone white-knuckled and around the strap of his headset. Timber 6, Nighthawk, say status over. Still nothing. Come on, Miller whispered so quiet Brooks almost missed it. Come on, come on. Then finally a voice ragged, breathless but unmistakably alive. Nighthawk, Timber 6. Holy hell, that was right on top of us. That was perfect. First position is down. I say again, first position is confirmed down. The small crowd near the hangar erupted into something between a cheer and a collective exhale, a release of tension that had been building since the moment the scramble alarm first tore through the desert night. Brooks felt his own shoulders drop for the first time in what felt like an hour, though he knew even as the relief hit him that it was premature. Second position is still active. Avery's voice cut through steady but sharper now, the exhaustion in it audible even through the transmission static. I'm coming back around for a second pass. Copy that. Nighthawk, be advised they've got at least 1 more firing position we haven't confirmed. Could be a third. We're taking sporadic fire from the eastern flank now too. Brooks's stomach dropped again. A third position, an unconfirmed threat. The exact kind of variable that turned a dangerous mission into an impossible one. Copy Timber 6. I'm adjusting my approach vector. Stand by. There was a pause and then something in Avery's tone shifted, not fear, but a kind of controlled clinical focus that Brooks recognized from somewhere deep in his own training, the sound of a person narrowing their entire world down to the next 4 seconds and nothing else. Command Nighthawk, be advised I'm seeing indications of a third position east of the marked smoke previously unconfirmed. Requesting updated intel if available. Harding's voice answered immediately strained. Nighthawk Command, we do not have confirmed intel on a third position. That sector was clean on our last reconnaissance pass 3 hours ago. Copy Command, but I'm telling you it's there. I can see muzzle flash patterns that don't match the 2 positions I've already engaged. Brooks looked at Miller. How does she know that? Because she's the only person tonight who's actually looked at that ground with her own eyes instead of a satellite photo, Miller said, voice low. Recon's good, Brooks, but it's not perfect. She's flying blind into gaps the system didn't catch, same as she predicted from the start. The radio crackled again, and this time it was Colonel Hale's voice, calm, but carrying an unmistakable undercurrent of tension. Nighthawk, this is Hale. You are cleared to use your judgment on target confirmation. I trust your assessment over 3-hour-old satellite data. Proceed as you see fit. Copy, sir. Rolling in on the third position now. Another pause, another held breath across the entire flight line. Brooks realized his hands had curled into fists again, and this time he didn't bother uncurling them. Nighthawk, this is dangerous. That sector's close to Timber 6's position. Confirm you have adequate separation. Confirming now, Avery said, and something in her voice had gone very quiet, very focused. The sound of a person doing math in her head that had life or death stakes attached to every digit. Timber 6. I need you to pull back 30 meters west if you can. I don't have the margin I'd like on this pass. A burst of static gunfire audible underneath it, and then Timber 6's voice strained. Copy, Nighthawk, pulling back and now moving. The transmission cut out mid-sentence, and for 3 unbearable seconds there was nothing but silence and the distant, muffled sound of ongoing gunfire. Timber 6 say status, Avery said, urgency finally cracking through her composure for the first time since takeoff. Nothing. Timber 6 Nighthawk, say status over. Brooks felt the entire flight line go rigid around him. Every person near that radio leaning in like their collective will could force a response out of dead air. Miller had stopped breathing entirely, staring at the speaker like it had personally betrayed him. Then finally, Nighthawk, Timber 6, we're good. We just lost comms for a second, pulling back through the brush. We are clear of the target zone. Repeat, we are clear. The relief that swept through the flight line was almost physical. A wave of exhaled breath and muttered curses, and someone near the back actually laughing short and disbelieving the sound of stress, finding release the only way it knew how. Copy, Timber 6, Avery said, and Brooks could hear something in her voice now that hadn't been there before. Not relief exactly, not yet, but the first crack of it waiting underneath everything else. Rolling in on the third position now. The roar came again, shorter this time, sharper, and then silence, and then finally, blessedly, Timber 6's voice no longer ragged with fear, but something closer to disbelief. Nighthawk, Timber 6 confirmed third position is down. All 3 positions confirmed neutralized. I say again, all threats neutralized. Brooks felt something break loose in his own chest, a tension he hadn't fully realized he'd been carrying since the moment he first saw Avery standing beside that aircraft 20 minutes. No, was it really only 20 minutes ago? But the mission wasn't over, and everyone on that flight line seemed to understand it in the same instant, because the celebration that had started to build died back down into tense, watchful silence, almost as quickly as it had risen. Nighthawk Command, Harding's voice cut through urgent. Be advised, we're now tracking a secondary threat, unconfirmed, but consistent with a reinforcement element moving toward Timber 6's position from the north. Recommend you maintain overhead coverage until extraction assets arrive. Copy, Command. I have enough fuel for approximately 11 more minutes on station. Where's extraction? Extraction is 14 minutes out, Nighthawk. The silence that followed that exchange felt different from every silence before it, heavier, sharper, kind of silence that Brooks understood instinctively, even without any military training, because the math was right there in front of everyone listening. 11 minutes of fuel, 14 minutes until help arrived. A 3-minute gap that nobody on that flight line knew how to fill. I'll make it work, Avery said, and something in the flatness of her voice told Brooks that she'd already done the same math. He had already understood the gap and had already decided somewhere in the space of half a second that she was going to close it through sheer stubbornness, if nothing else. Nighthawk, that's not a comfortable margin, Harding said. It's not supposed to be comfortable, sir. It's supposed to be enough. Miller let out a breath beside Brooks that sounded almost like a laugh, disbelieving and exhausted at once. She's going to stretch that fuel by flying lean patterns, minimal maneuvering, conserving everything she can. It's going to be close. How close? Close enough that I don't want to think about it, Miller admitted. The minutes that followed crawled by in a way that felt entirely disconnected from the clock on Brooks's own wrist, each one stretched thin by tension, punctuated by short-clipped transmissions between Avery and Timber 6 as she circled overhead, watching for the reinforcement element. Command had warned about her voice growing steadily more strained with each exchange, even as her words never lost their precision. Timber 6, I have movement north of your position, approximately 400 meters. Looks like 6 to 8 personnel moving in your direction. Copy Nighthawk, we see them too. We're low on ammunition. If they close the distance, we're going to be in trouble. Brooks felt his jaw tighten. Low on ammunition. Another variable nobody had accounted for, another piece of the puzzle sliding into place at the worst possible moment. I have eyes on them, Avery said. I can engage, but I want to confirm, is there any friendly element between my position and theirs? I do not want a mistake tonight. Negative, Nighthawk. That's a clean shot. They are hostile. Repeat, hostile, and closing. Copy, engaging now. The roar came again, longer this time, more sustained, and Brooks found himself gripping the edge of a nearby equipment cart without remembering when he'd reach for it. The sound stretched on for what felt like an impossibly long time before it finally cut off, replaced by ringing silence, and then finally Timber 6's voice, breathless, with something that was no longer just fear. Nighthawk, Timber 6, that's a direct hit. Reinforcement element is down. I say again, down. They are not moving. A ragged cheer went up from somewhere near the hangar, but Brooks barely registered it. His attention locked entirely on the radio, on the sound of Avery's breathing coming through the transmission. Faster now. More labored, the sound of a body that had been running on pure adrenaline for the better part of 15 minutes, finally starting to show cracks. Command, Nighthawk, she said, and her voice had changed thinner, now edged with something that hadn't been there before. Fuel status is getting tight. I need an update on extraction. Nighthawk, extraction is 6 minutes out. Brooks did the math again, and this time the numbers didn't line up in anyone's favor. Copy, Avery said, and there was a pause, a fraction too long before she spoke again. I'm going to need to break station before that. I don't have 6 minutes of fuel margin left for combat maneuvering. Miller's face went pale. She's cutting it too close. What happens if she runs out? Brooks asked, already dreading the answer. Then she's flying a very expensive glider over hostile terrain in the dark, Miller said grimly, and hoping she can make it back to friendly airspace before gravity has the final word. The radio crackled again, and this time it was Hale's voice, low and urgent. Nighthawk, this is Hale. Break station now. Timber 6 has held their position. Reinforcements neutralize extraction inbound. You have done everything required of you. Return to base immediately. That is a direct order. There was a pause, a long one. Long enough that Brooks felt his chest tighten all over again, terrified that something had happened in that silence that nobody on the ground could see or stop. Then Avery's voice came back, quieter than before, edged with something that sounded dangerously like exhaustion, finally winning the fight it had been losing for the last 20 minutes. Copy, sir. Breaking station now, heading back. Fuel status? Another pause. Tight, sir, but manageable. Miller exhaled sharply beside Brooks. That's not a real answer. That's the answer you give when you don't want people worrying about the real number. Brooks felt a fresh wave of dread settle into his stomach. You think she's in trouble? I think, Miller said slowly, watching the dark sky like he could somehow will the aircraft into view through sheer focus. That she just spent the last 15 minutes burning fuel she couldn't spare to save men she'd never met before that mission, and now she's got to fly 70 miles back through the dark on fumes, injured, exhausted, and probably in more pain than she's letting any of us hear in her voice. The flight line fell into a different kind of silence after that. Not the tense electric silence of combat unfolding over the radio, but something heavier, more personal. The silence of people who had just watched someone risk everything for strangers and now had to wait helpless to find out if that sacrifice was going to cost more than anyone had bargained for. Brooks looked up at the dark sky, searching for a light that wasn't there yet, and felt something settle into his chest that he suspected would stay there long after tonight ended, a strange aching mixture of pride and fear, and something that felt uncomfortably close to responsibility, as if some part of him had attached itself permanently to the outcome of a mission he tried to stop from happening at all. Command, this is Timber 6, the radio crackled, and Brooks felt the whole flight line lean in again. We want it on record that pilots saved every man in this unit tonight. Whoever she is, whatever her story is, she flew straight into a fight nobody else could have won. Harding's voice answered quieter than before, almost reverent. Copy that, Timber 6. Message received. Nighthawk command, get home safe. That's an order too. But the radio stayed quiet after that. No confirmation, no response, nothing but the low crackle of an open channel and the sound of a fuel gauge somewhere 70 miles out, ticking closer and closer to a number nobody on the ground wanted to think about. And somewhere in that silence, Brooks realized with a cold certainty that settled deep into his bones that the hardest part of tonight might not have been stopping her at all. It might be waiting to find out if she made it back. The silence stretched on for 4 minutes that felt like 40, and Brooks spent every one of them staring at a patch of empty sky like he could physically drag the aircraft back into view if he just refused to look away. Command, this is Tower. A new voice broke in tight with concentration. We have a contact on radar bearing consistent with returning aircraft, but altitude and speed profile are irregular. Brooks's stomach dropped straight through the concrete. Irregular how? Miller was already moving toward the tower relay speaker mounted near the hangar. Jaw clenched so tight Brooks could see the muscle working under his skin. Irregular means something's wrong. Altitude's not irregular when everything's fine. Altitude's irregular when a pilot's compensating for something. The radio crackled again, and this time it was Avery's voice, and the moment Brooks heard it, he understood exactly what Miller meant, because the steadiness that had carried her through the last 20 minutes was gone, replaced by something thinner. More strained words coming out in short bursts between what sounded like controlled, deliberate breaths. Tower Nighthawk, be advised, I'm reading a fuel warning I don't like the look of. Requesting priority approach, direct in no pattern. Nighthawk Tower, copy, you are cleared. Direct all traffic is holding for you. Runway 27 is yours the moment you want it. Copy, Tower, appreciate it. Something about the clipped, careful way she said those last two words, appreciate it, made Brooks's chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with protocol and everything to do with the sound of a person conserving energy, rationing even their own speech, because everything else in their body was being spent on staying in the air. She's hurting, Miller said quietly, almost to himself. You don't know that. I know exactly what that voice sounds like, Brooks. I've heard it before. That's not fuel anxiety. That's pain talking through gritted teeth. Brooks looked toward the dark horizon again, and this time finally he saw it, a single point of light, low and moving fast, cutting through the black in a trajectory that even to his untrained eye looked wrong. Somehow too flat, too fast, lacking the smooth, controlled descent he vaguely remembered from watching aircraft land on quieter nights. There, he said, pointing. That's her. The small crowd that had gathered near the hangar turned as one, every face tilting upward toward that single approaching light, and Brooks felt the collective tension of the entire flight line condense into something almost unbearable. A held breath, 40 people wide. Nighthawk Tower, we have you on visual. You are looking good. Continue approach. Copy, Avery said, and this time there was no mistaking it. Her voice had gone tight with strain, each word costing something visible, even through the radio. Continuing approach. The aircraft grew larger against the black sky, its landing lights sharpening from a single point into two distinct beams cutting downward through the darkness. And Brooks realized he was holding his breath again, watching the trajectory with the same helpless intensity as everyone else around him, willing it silently to stay level, to stay controlled, to just get down safely and let this be over. Airspeed's high, Miller muttered, eyes locked on the approaching jet. She's coming in too fast. Is that bad? It's not good. Fast landing means less margin for error, and with fuel this tight, if she has to go around for any reason. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The radio crackled again, Tower's voice climbing half an octave with tension. Nighthawk Tower, your airspeed is above standard approach parameters. Confirm you are able to slow for landing. A pause that stretched on for 1, 2, 3 unbearable seconds, before Avery's voice came back thinner than before, fighting for control. Copy, Tower, I'm working on it. Fuel state is critical. I need this approach to work the first time. Brooks felt Miller go rigid beside him. She's saying she doesn't have fuel for a go-around. What does that mean? It means if this landing isn't clean, Miller said, voice dropping low, there's no second chance. She either puts that jet down safely right now or... He stopped himself again, and this time Brooks didn't need him to finish because the aircraft was close enough now that Brooks could hear the engines directly, no longer filtered through a radio speaker, but roaring raw and immediate across the flight line, growing louder by the second, as it dropped toward the runway threshold at a speed that even Brooks's inexperienced eye could tell was faster than it should have been. "Come on," Miller whispered the words barely audible over the engine noise. "Come on, Cap, bring it down easy. Come on." The jet crossed the runway threshold in a blur of light and sound, and for one terrifying half-second, Brooks watched it seem to hang there suspended between sky and ground, before the wheels finally touched down with a violent shriek of rubber against concrete that seemed to rattle every window on the base at once. The aircraft bounced. Just slightly, a small, jarring lurch that sent a collective gasp through the crowd gathered near the hangar before the wheels caught again, and the jet's nose dropped, hard engines screaming into reverse thrust, as Avery fought to bleed off speed on a runway that suddenly seemed far too short for what was happening on it. "She's not slowing fast enough," Miller said, voice tight with barely controlled panic. "She's not slowing fast enough." The jet hurtled down the runway, brakes engaged now, the whole aircraft shuddering visibly under the force of deceleration, and Brooks found himself moving without deciding to sprinting alongside the perimeter fence toward the far end of the runway, where emergency vehicles were already scrambling into motion lights, strobing red and blue against the dark desert sand. Fire crew, stand by for possible runway excursion." Tower's voice crackled urgently over every open channel on the base. "Nighthawk, do you copy? Do you copy?" Silence. Brooks's lungs burned as he ran his eyes locked on the jet as it continued down the runway, still moving too fast, brakes screaming audibly. Now, even from this distance, the entire aircraft seeming to shudder with the effort of trying to stop. "Nighthawk Tower, do you copy?" Still nothing. And then finally, mercifully, the aircraft's speed began to bleed away, the violent shudder softening into something more controlled, until at last, impossibly, it rolled to a stop, with barely 100 feet of runway, to spare engines winding down into a low, exhausted whine that seemed to mirror everything Brooks was feeling in his own chest. "Nighthawk is down." Tower's voice broke through, flooded with relief. "Nighthawk is down and stopped. All units converge. All units converge." The flight line erupted. Emergency vehicles surged toward the aircraft from every direction. Lights flashing, sirens cutting through the desert night in a chaotic symphony of relief and residual panic. Brooks reached the taxiway just as the ground crew arrived, watching as they scrambled toward the jet, with fire extinguishers and medical kits, watching the canopy begin its slow mechanical climb upward, watching for any sign of movement from the cockpit that would tell him finally that she was okay. For 3 agonizing seconds, there was nothing. Then a hand appeared at the edge of the cockpit, gripping the canopy rail, and Brooks felt something in his chest release so violently it was almost painful, a wave of relief so overwhelming it nearly buckled his knees. "She's moving," Miller said beside him, breathless from the sprint, voice cracking with emotion he clearly wasn't bothering to hide anymore. "She's moving. Thank God she's moving." Medical personnel swarmed the ladder, helping Avery unbuckle from the cockpit with careful, urgent hands. And when she finally emerged, pale and visibly shaking, one arm wrapped instinctively around her ribs, Brooks felt something crack open in his chest that he hadn't expected. Not relief exactly, though there was plenty of that, but something rawer, more personal, the specific ache of watching someone survive something you'd been terrified they wouldn't. "Easy, easy," a medic said, guiding her down the ladder with careful hands. "We've got you, Captain. We've got you." Avery's legs buckled the moment her feet touched the tarmac, and only the medic's quick grip kept her upright, her face draining of what little color it had left, pain finally breaking through whatever iron will had kept it locked away for the last 25 minutes. "Get a stretcher," someone shouted. "Get a stretcher now." "I don't need a stretcher." Avery managed, though her voice had lost every trace of the steady command it carried during the flight, replaced now with something thin and exhausted and very, very human. "I can walk." "Ma'am, with respect," the medic said firmly, "you flew a combat sortie with cracked ribs and a concussion, and you just landed a jet on fumes. You're getting a stretcher whether you want one or not." For a moment, something almost like a laugh escaped her, weak and pain but real. "Fair enough." Brooks pushed through the gathering crowd until he was close enough to see her clearly, and when her eyes found his, something passed between them that didn't need words, an acknowledgement of everything that had happened in the last half hour, of how impossibly far they'd traveled from the moment he'd screamed at her to step away from that aircraft. "You made it," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. Barely, Avery admitted, wincing as the medics eased her onto the stretcher, cutting it closer than I'd like to admit. Tower said you were coming in too fast. I was, she said. Didn't have the fuel margin to do it any other way. Either I put it down clean the first time, or I was going to be walking home from somewhere a lot less friendly than this runway. Miller crouched beside the stretcher, relief and exhaustion warring visibly on his face. You scared the hell out of all of us, Cap. Story of my life, apparently, Avery said, attempting a smile that didn't quite make it past the pain etched into her expression. The medics began wheeling the stretcher toward the waiting ambulance, and Brooks found himself walking alongside it without consciously deciding, to some instinct pulling him forward, that he didn't examine too closely. Timber 6, he said. They're all okay, but the extraction confirmed a few minutes ago, Miller answered from Avery's other side, checking his radio. All personnel accounted for minor injuries, only no fatalities. Something in Avery's face shifted when she heard that, the tight, controlled mask of professional focus finally cracking open into something raw or more emotional, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes that she blinked back with visible effort. No fatalities, she repeated quietly, almost to herself, like she needed to hear the words out loud to fully believe them. Because of you, Brooks said. Because of a lot of people, she corrected, though her voice wavered slightly. The ground crew that prepped that jet in 4 minutes. The tower controller, who cleared me straight in without hesitation. Command for trusting information from someone who technically shouldn't have even been on this base tonight. She paused, looking at Brooks directly. And you, for listening when every rule you had ever been trained on told you not to. Brooks didn't know what to say to that, so for a moment he said nothing at all, just walked alongside the stretcher as the ambulance doors swung open ahead of them, the flashing lights casting alternating red and white across all their faces. I almost didn't, he admitted finally. Listen, I mean, if Miller hadn't shown up when he did. But he did, Avery said, and you did listen eventually. That's what matters. I don't know if command's going to see it that way. Brooks said, the reality of the situation settling back over him now that the immediate crisis had passed. You went AWOL from a medical facility. I let an unauthorized individual talk her way onto a live aircraft during a combat scramble. There's going to be a report, probably an investigation. Avery's expression sobered, the exhaustion in her face deepening with something that looked almost like resignation. I know. Does that scare you? Less than watching Timber 6 die on an open radio channel would have, she said simply. I made my choice, knowing there'd be consequences. I'll deal with them. That's not your burden to carry, Sergeant. Brooks, he said. Ethan Brooks. Something softened in her face just slightly, despite the pain and exhaustion pulling at every feature. Ethan, she repeated, testing the name. Thank you for everything you did tonight, including the part where you tried to arrest me. Despite everything, the adrenaline, the fear, the raw exhaustion still coursing through his own system, Brooks found himself almost smiling. You're welcome, I think. The medics began loading the stretcher into the ambulance, and Avery reached out, suddenly catching Brooks's sleeve with surprising strength for someone who'd nearly collapsed getting out of a cockpit minutes earlier. Hey, she said, voice a quieter, now more serious. Whatever happens with the report, whatever command decides about tonight, you did your job. You did it exactly right up until the moment doing it right stopped being the same thing as doing what was needed. That's not a failure, Ethan. That's the hardest kind of judgment call there is, and you made it under pressure with no warning, with no time to think it through. Most people freeze in that moment. You didn't. Brooks felt something tighten in his throat that had nothing to do with the cold desert air. Almost got it wrong. Almost isn't the same as did, Avery said, releasing his sleeve as the medics moved to close the ambulance doors. Remember that. The doors shut with a heavy final sound, and Brooks stood there on the tarmac watching the ambulance pull away toward the base medical facility, red lights fading into the pre-dawn darkness until Miller's hand landed on his shoulder, grounding him back in the present moment. You did good tonight, Miller said quietly. I almost stopped her, Dave, if you hadn't shown up. But I did show up, Miller said, echoing Avery's words from moments earlier. And you listened. That's the part that matters. Protocol's supposed to slow things down long enough for the truth to catch up. Tonight it did exactly that. A little slower than any of us would have liked maybe, but it worked. Brooks looked back toward the runway, toward the now empty aircraft still sitting where it had rolled to its final shuddering stop, ground crew already swarming around it for post-flight inspection, the adrenaline of the last half hour beginning to drain out of the base and leave behind something quieter, heavier, more reflective. "What happens now?" he asked. Miller shrugged, though the gesture carried none of its usual casualness. "Now we write reports. Command reviews everything. Somebody somewhere decides whether tonight was a security breach that happened to end well or something else entirely." "What do you think it was?" Miller was quiet for a long moment, watching the sky lighten almost imperceptibly. At the eastern edge of the horizon, the first hint of dawn beginning to bleed into the darkness that had swallowed the entire base for the last hour. "I think," he said slowly, "it was a system built for a world where everything happens on schedule colliding with a night where nothing did. And somewhere in that collision, a woman who should have been in a hospital bed 140 miles from here ended up being the only thing standing between a dozen men and a body bag." He paused. "I don't know what you call that, Brooks, but I don't think breach is the right word." Brooks nodded slowly, turning the words over in his mind, feeling the weight of the last hour settle into something more permanent, something that felt less like an incident report and more like a lesson he suspected he'd be carrying for a very long time. The radio at his hip crackled one final time, Harding's voice coming through quieter now, stripped of the urgency that had defined every transmission for the last 30 minutes. "All personnel, this is command. Mission status complete. Timber 6 extraction confirmed, all personnel safe. Nighthawk pilot en route to medical for evaluation, condition stable. Colonel Hale has requested that all involved parties report for debrief at 0900. Well done tonight, all of you." Brooks lowered his gaze from the brightening horizon and looked at Miller, who was already looking back at him with the exhausted, hollowed-out expression of a man who had just lived through something he wouldn't fully process for days. "Oh, 900, Brooks said. "That's not much time to figure out what I'm even going to say." "Say what happened," Miller said simply. "That's usually the easiest version of the truth to defend." Brooks huffed out something between a laugh and a sigh, the tension of the last hour finally beginning to loosen its grip on his shoulders. "You make it sound simple." "It is simple," Miller said, starting to walk back toward the hangar, waving for Brooks to follow. "It's just not easy. Those are different things." They walked back across the tarmac together in silence for a while, the base slowly settling back into something resembling normal rhythm around them. Ground crews finishing post-flight inspections, security teams standing down from heightened alert, the low murmur of relieved conversation drifting from small clusters of airmen who'd witnessed some version of tonight's events from different vantage points across the installation. Brooks glanced back once toward the runway, toward the aircraft marked Nighthawk, sitting quiet and still, now under the floodlights, engines cooled, mission complete, and felt something settle in his chest that he suspected he'd carry with him long after this night became just another entry in a logbook somewhere. "Miller," he said, "yeah. Do you think she'll fly again? After all this, the injury, the AWOL charge, whatever command decides to do with her." Miller considered the question for a long moment, his expression thoughtful in the pale light of approaching dawn. "I think," he said finally, "that woman just proved she doesn't know how to be anything other than exactly what that base needed tonight, rules or no rules, body ready or not. I don't think there's a version of the future where she stops being that person just because someone writes a report about tonight." He paused, glancing back toward the medical facility where the ambulance had disappeared minutes earlier. "The real question isn't whether she flies again, Brooks. It's whether the system's smart enough to let her." Brooks didn't have an answer for that, so he didn't try to give one. Instead, he simply nodded, and the two of them continued walking back toward the hangar in silence, leaving behind a runway that had, in the span of one impossible hour, hosted the kind of story that flight lines rarely got to witness, the kind where protocol and heroism collided head-on, and somehow against every reasonable expectation, both sides walked away, having been right. But as the sun began its slow climb over the eastern ridgeline, casting the first pale light across a base that had spent the entire night holding its breath, Brooks couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest conversation of the entire night, the one waiting for him at 0900, the one that would decide not just his fate, but Avery's as well, hadn't even started yet. Brooks didn't sleep before 0900. He tried lying flat on his bunk for maybe 40 minutes, staring at the ceiling, replaying the last 6 hours on a loop. He couldn't switch off, but sleep never came close enough to matter. By the time he showered, changed into a fresh uniform, and walked the long corridor toward the administration building, his hands were still faintly trembling, and he didn't bother pretending otherwise. Miller was already waiting outside the debrief room, leaning against the wall, with 2 cups of coffee, holding one out the moment Brooks approached. "You look like hell," Miller said. "Feel like it too." "Good. Means you're taking this seriously." Brooks took the coffee, wrapped both hands around it more for the warmth than the caffeine. "Any word on her condition?" "Cracked ribs confirmed worse than they thought," Miller said. "Concussion's more severe too. She's stable, but they're keeping her under observation." She insisted on being here for this, apparently. Doctors weren't thrilled. "That sounds like her." "Yeah," Miller said, something almost fond in his voice despite the exhaustion. "It really does." The door to the debrief room opened before Brooks could ask anything else, and an aide gestured them both inside with brisk efficiency. The room was smaller than Brooks expected, a long table, a handful of chairs, a screen at the far end, still displaying a frozen frame of radar tracking data from the night before. Colonel Hale sat at the head of the table, flanked by Major Harding on one side and a woman Brooks didn't recognize on the other, her uniform marking her as someone from the Judge Advocate General's office. And across from them, already seated pale but upright ribs, visibly wrapped beneath her uniform, was Avery. She looked up when Brooks and Miller entered, and something passed between them again. Brief, wordless, but grounding, like 2 people who had survived something together and didn't need to explain it to anyone else in the room. "Sit," Hale said, not unkindly, gesturing toward the empty chairs. Brooks sat. Miller sat beside him. The room settled into a tense waiting silence, while Hale shuffled a small stack of papers in front of him, his expression unreadable, in the particular way Brooks imagined came only after decades of command. "I'll start with the obvious," Hale said finally. "Last night was by every technical definition in the regulations I've sworn to uphold a disaster. An unauthorized individual breached restricted access to a live combat aircraft during an active scramble. A pilot under strict medical hold violated that hold and took command of a military asset without proper clearance. A staff sergeant on flight line security allowed an unverified individual radio access to command channels during a crisis." He looked up, eyes moving slowly across the table. "On paper, every single person in this room did something they weren't supposed to do." Silence. Brooks felt his stomach tighten, the coffee in his hands suddenly feeling less like comfort and more like something to grip onto. "And yet," Hale continued, setting the papers down, 12 soldiers are alive this morning who had a very real chance of not being alive because every single one of those violations happened in exactly the right sequence, at exactly the right moment, for exactly the right reasons." He let that sit in his room for a moment before turning his attention directly to Brooks. "Staff Sergeant Brooks, walk me through your decision-making last night. Not what regulation says you should have done, what you actually did and why." Brooks swallowed hard, set his coffee down, and made himself meet the colonel's eyes. "Sir, I followed protocol exactly as trained, right up until I had direct corroborated evidence that following it further would cost lives." Crew Chief Miller positively identified Captain Reeves. She demonstrated detailed operational knowledge that no unauthorized civilian could possibly have had. And when the scramble alert came through naming a unit, she claimed direct tactical knowledge of, "I made the call to escalate to command rather than continuing to physically restrain her. You could have kept her restrained and let command sort it out through normal channels." "Yes, sir, I could have. I judged that the time cost of doing that outweighed the risk of letting her speak directly to command myself." "That's not your judgment call to make, Sergeant. That's several ranks above your pay grade." Brooks felt his jaw tighten, but he held the colonel's gaze. "I understand that, sir. I made it anyway. I'd make it again." For a long moment, Hale said nothing, simply studying Brooks with an expression that gave away nothing at all. Then unexpectedly, something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but close enough that Brooks felt the tension in his chest ease slightly. "Good," Hale said. "Because that's exactly the answer I wanted to hear, and it's the only one that would have kept you out of serious trouble this morning." Brooks blinked. "Sir, Sergeant Security Protocol exists to prevent chaos, not to create it in situations where the truth is standing right in front of you, bleeding and telling you exactly what's at stake. You didn't break protocol last night. You executed the hardest, least comfortable version of it, the version where you have to use judgment instead of just following a checklist." Hale leaned back slightly in his chair. There's a difference between a security failure and a security officer choosing, under extreme pressure, to escalate rather than obstruct. You did the second thing. That's not a violation. That's exactly what we train people for and almost never actually get. Brooks felt something loosen in his chest that had been wound tight since the moment the scramble alarm first went off. Hale's attention shifted next to Avery, and his expression sobered considerably. "Captain Reeves?" "Sir," Avery said, straightening despite the visible effort it cost her. "You are currently facing formal review for violation of medical hold status and unauthorized use of a military aircraft. Both are serious. Both, under different circumstances, could end a career." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "I want you to understand that I'm not dismissing the severity of what you did." "I understand, sir. But I also have a transcript," Hale continued, "of 12 men from Timber 6 who are alive this morning, specifically because you knew a canyon corridor better than every piece of satellite intelligence this base had access to. I have Major Harding's assessment that no other pilot on this installation could have executed that mission with the same margin for error. And I have a flight surgeon telling me you landed that aircraft with fuel reserves so thin they're still trying to figure out how you made the runway at all." Avery didn't respond to that, just sat there, jaw tight, waiting for whatever came next. "So here is what's going to happen," Hale said. "The medical hold violation will be formally noted in your record, along with a reprimand. That's not optional, and frankly, Captain, you should expect it and accept it, because if I let this slide without consequence, I'm telling every pilot on this base that ignoring medical orders is acceptable as long as it works out. It is not acceptable. It simply happened to work out." "Understood, sir." "However," Hale continued, "the unauthorized use of the aircraft is being reclassified effective this morning as an emergency field authorization retroactively approved under my direct command override during the incident, which means on paper you did not steal a military aircraft last night, Captain. You flew a mission I authorized under extraordinary circumstances with full command backing." He paused. "The distinction matters. It's the difference between a court-martial and a commendation." The room went very still. Avery's composure, which had held steady through every question, every accusation, every moment of the debrief so far, finally cracked just slightly, her eyes glistening for a moment before she blinked it back, jaw tightening with the effort of maintaining control. "Sir, don't thank me yet," Hale said, not unkindly. "You're still grounded for a minimum of 30 days non-negotiable, and that's if your ribs heal on schedule, which, given how hard you apparently pushed that airframe last night, I'm not entirely confident they will. You are also required to complete a full psychological evaluation before returning to active flight status, standard procedure. After this kind of incident, no exceptions." "Understood, sir." "And Captain," Hale's voice softened just slightly, the formal edge of command briefly giving way to something more personal. "For what it's worth, in 28 years of service, I have never once authorized a mission the way I authorized yours last night, on instinct, on trust, on a voice over a radio telling me things that shouldn't have been possible for her to know. I don't make decisions like that lightly. I made it because everything you said checked out second by second, exactly as you said it would. That doesn't happen by accident. That happens because you know that terrain better than anyone alive, and because you were willing to risk everything to use that knowledge when it mattered most." Avery's throat worked visibly for a moment before she managed to speak. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me," Hale said again, quieter this time. "Thank the 12 men who got to go home to their families this morning because of what you did. That's the only thanks that matters." The debrief continued for another 20 minutes. Procedural details, paperwork requirements, a formal statement. Brooks would need to file about his own actions on the flight line, but Brooks found himself only half listening. His attention kept drifting back to Avery, to the quiet, exhausted relief settling into her features as the weight of the last 12 hours finally began to lift. When Hale finally dismissed the room, Brooks lingered near the door waiting, while Avery gathered herself, slowly still moving with the careful, deliberate caution of someone whose ribs were reminding her of every decision she'd made the night before. "Hey," he said, falling into step beside her as she made her way toward the corridor. "Hey, yourself?" She said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth despite the exhaustion etched into every line of her face. 30 days grounded. How do you feel about that? Honestly, she considered the question for a moment. Relieved, I don't think my body was planning on giving me a choice anyway. Brooks huffed out a quiet laugh, some of the tension of the morning finally beginning to drain out of his shoulders. You scared the hell out of me last night. You know that, right? I scared myself a little too, Avery admitted, surprising him with the honesty of get it. That landing was closer than I let on during the debrief. How close? She glanced at him sideways, something wry and exhausted in her expression. Close enough that I'm genuinely not sure I want to know the exact number. Some things are better left unquantified. They walked in silence for a moment, the corridor quiet around them, sunlight streaming through the windows in a way that felt almost surreal after the chaos of the night, before the bass slowly returning to its normal, unremarkable rhythm, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all, as if lives hadn't hung in the balance just hours earlier. Can I ask you something? Brooks said finally. Depends on the something. 11 days ago, when you got pulled out of that mission injured, did you know then that you'd end up doing something like this? Or did last night just happen? Avery was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the same careful precision she seemed to bring to everything. I think, she said slowly, some part of me knew I wasn't done with that corridor. I kept thinking about it even in recovery, even when I was supposed to be resting. I kept running the terrain through my head over and over like my brain refused to let it go until I'd finished something I hadn't realized I'd started. She paused. When I heard that broadcast last night, it didn't feel like a decision exactly. It felt more like finally getting the chance to finish something I'd been carrying around unfinished for 11 days. Brooks nodded slowly, turning that over in his mind. That's a heavy thing to carry. It is, Avery agreed, but it's lighter this morning than it was yesterday. That's worth something. They reached the end of the corridor where it opened out toward the flight line, the same stretch of tarmac where everything had started less than 12 hours earlier. Avery paused there, looking out toward the runway, where NIGHTHAWK sat quiet and still, now ground crew already crawling over it for full post-flight inspection, the aircraft looking almost ordinary in the bright morning light, nothing like the impossible, violent thing that had torn through the desert sky the night before. You know, she said, I owe you an actual apology. Brooks glanced at her surprised. For what? For putting you in an impossible position last night. You had every right to have me arrested on the spot, and instead I stood there and made you choose between your training and something you had no way of verifying in the moment. That's not fair to ask of anyone. You didn't ask me to trust you, Brooks said. You just told me the truth and let me decide what to do with it. That's different. Maybe, Avery said, but it still puts you in a position where you had to bet your career on a stranger's word in the middle of a crisis with almost no time to think it through. I don't take that lightly. Brooks considered that for a moment, watching the ground crew move around the aircraft in the distance, methodical and unhurried now that the emergency had passed. For what it's worth, he said finally, I don't think I was betting on a stranger's word. Not really. I think I was betting on everything you did while you were standing there, the way you talked about that jet, the way Miller reacted the second he saw you, the way you never once tried to make the lie sound better than the truth. I wasn't trusting a story. I was trusting what I was watching happen in front of me. Something in Avery's expression softened at that genuine warmth, breaking through the exhaustion for the first time since Brooks had met her. That's a generous way to put it. It's the honest way to put it, Brooks said. I almost got it wrong last night. I want to be clear about that. If Miller hadn't shown up when he did, if you hadn't had the patience to keep explaining instead of just trying to force your way past me, I don't know if I make the right call in time. That scares me more than anything else that happened last night. Avery studied him for a moment, something thoughtful in her gaze. You know what I think, Ethan? I think the fact that it scares you is exactly why you made the right call. People who don't think carefully about the weight of their decisions are the ones who get it wrong. You clearly do think about it. That's not a weakness. That's the whole point of having someone like you on that line in the first place. Brooks didn't have a response to that, so for a moment he just stood there, letting the words settle, watching the morning light stretch further across the tarmac, watching the base breathe again after a night that had asked more of everyone in it than any of them had expected to give. What happens now, he asked finally. For you, I mean. 30 days grounded psyche eval, and then what? Then I heal, Avery said simply. And then if the doctors clear me and the evaluation goes the way I expect it to, I go back to flying. This job doesn't stop needing people just because one mission almost broke me. Doesn't that scare you, going back up there again? Every time, Avery admitted. It scared me 11 days ago. It scared me last night. It'll scare me again the next time I climb into a cockpit. But fear's not really the thing that decides whether I go. It's just the thing that comes along for the ride. Brooks found himself smiling slightly, despite the exhaustion still weighing heavy behind his eyes. You make it sound simple. It's not simple, Avery said, echoing Miller's words from the night before without knowing it. It's just necessary. Those are different things. They stood there a moment longer, two people who had met under the worst possible circumstances and somehow found their way to something that felt against every reasonable expectation, like the beginning of a genuine friendship forged not in comfort, but in the specific, unrepeatable pressure of a night. Neither one of them would ever fully explain to anyone who hadn't lived through it. I should get back to medical, Avery said finally. They're probably already annoyed I left without permission. Probably, Brooks agreed. You do have a track record. That earned him a genuine laugh, short and surprised, the first real laugh he'd heard from her since the whole impossible night began. Fair point. She started to turn, then paused, looking back at him with an expression that had shifted into something quieter, more sincere. Thank you, Ethan. Really. Not for letting me onto that flight line. For everything after. For believing something that had no business sounding believable and doing it fast enough that it mattered. You made it easy to believe, Brooks said. Eventually. Eventually counts, Avery said. That's the whole lesson, isn't it? Nobody gets it perfect the first 10 seconds. What matters is whether you get there before it's too late. She walked away down the corridor, moving carefully, favoring her ribs with every step. And Brooks stood there watching her go, feeling the full weight of the last 12 hours finally settle into something he could actually carry, instead of something that had been carrying him. Miller found him there a few minutes later, two fresh cups of coffee in hand, sliding one into Brooks's grip without a word. Debrief go all right? Miller asked. Better than I expected, Brooks said. She's not getting court-martialed. Hale reclassified the whole thing as emergency authorization. Miller let out a low whistle. Didn't expect that. Good for her. 30 days grounded psych eval formal reprimand for the medical hold violation, Brooks continued. But no career-ending consequences. She's going to fly again. Good, Miller said, and there was real weight behind the word. This job needs more people like her. Fewer, honestly, might be better for everyone's blood pressure. But the ones we've got, we need to keep them. Brooks looked out toward the runway with him, one more time toward the aircraft marked NIGHTHAWK, sitting quiet under the morning sun. Engines cold now, mission complete. The violence of the night before, nothing but a memory recorded in radar logs and radio transcripts, and the exhausted, grateful faces of 12 soldiers who'd made it home because a woman refused to stay in a hospital bed when she knew exactly what was at stake. You know what I keep thinking about, Brooks said. What's that? The moment before all of it, before the scramble alarm, before Miller showed up, before any of it made sense. I had my hand on my sidearm, Dave. I genuinely thought I was looking at a security threat. You were following your training. I know, Brooks said, but that's what gets me. My training was right and she was right, and somehow both of those things were true at the same time. And the only thing that made the difference between disaster and 12 men going home was whether I was willing to listen for 4 more minutes than protocol strictly required. Miller was quiet for a moment, considering that. That's the job, though, isn't it? Not just following the rules, knowing when the rules need a human being standing behind them, paying attention, willing to adjust when the world doesn't match the paperwork. Brooks nodded slowly, turning the words over, feeling them settle into something he suspected would stay with him for the rest of his career. A lesson learned not from a training manual, but from a desperate, bleeding woman standing beside a jet in the middle of the night, refusing to be turned away from a mission that mattered more than anyone's comfort, including her own. The base moved on around them, the ordinary rhythm of a working installation, resuming as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. Ground crews finishing routine maintenance, pilots heading toward briefing rooms for entirely unrelated missions. The low, constant hum of a place built to be ready for anything every single day, whether anything happened or not. But Brooks knew, standing there with his coffee cooling in his hands, watching the sun climb fully over the eastern ridgeline, that something on this base had shifted permanently in the space of one impossible night. Not in any policy, not in any regulation, but in the quiet, unspoken understanding shared by everyone who had witnessed it, that sometimes the system built to keep people safe needed someone brave enough and human enough to bend it exactly when it mattered most. He thought about Avery's words from the flight line the night before, that she hadn't lied to him because lying to someone doing their job right just made the whole system worse. He thought about Hale's decision to reclassify an unauthorized flight as an emergency authorization, choosing truth over paperwork, judgment over procedure in a moment that could have destroyed a career instead of honoring one. He thought about Miller's unwavering trust the instant he recognized her, about Timber Six's grateful, disbelieving voice, confirming they were still alive, about every single decision made in the dark under pressure by people who had no time to be certain and chose to act anyway. That was the part nobody would ever fully capture in an official report, Brooks realized. Not the flight data, not the fuel calculations, not the formal transcript of radio transmissions that would be filed away in some archive and forgotten within a year. The part that actually mattered was smaller than that and far harder to write down: the 4 minutes a security officer chose to listen instead of restrain. The split second a crew chief recognized a face and staked his own credibility on it. The impossible resolve of a woman who refused to let broken ribs and a fractured chain of command stand between her and the men she knew she could save. Brooks finished his coffee in silence, watching the base breathe around him, and understood with a clarity that felt permanent that he hadn't just survived a security incident the night before. He had watched up close exactly what it looked like when protocol and courage collided head-on, and instead of one destroying the other, they had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, saved 12 men's lives together. The system hadn't failed that night. It had simply needed, for one impossible hour, a human being willing to stand in the gap between what the rules said and what the moment demanded, and it had found one twice over in a staff sergeant who chose to listen and a pilot who refused to stay grounded when it mattered most. That was the whole story in the end. Not a security breach, not a broken chain of command, just two people doing their jobs exactly right in a night that asked them both to redefine what right actually meant. And somewhere in that redefinition, an entire unit of soldiers got to go home. And that Brooks thought, watching the sun finally clear the ridgeline and spill gold light across the flight line where it had all begun, was worth every rule either of them had bent to make it happen. 3 weeks passed before Brooks saw her again, and in that time the story of what happened on the flight line that night had already begun to take on a strange second life of its own. Whispered between shifts, retold in the chow hall, with details that grew a little more dramatic each time, until Brooks barely recognized the versions some of the newer airmen were telling each other by the second week. In their version, he had drawn his weapon. In another, Avery had collapsed the moment she landed and had to be resuscitated on the tarmac. He never bothered correcting any of it. Some stories he was learning belonged to the people who needed to believe in them more than they belonged to the people who actually lived them. What he did know, because Miller kept him updated with the reliable efficiency of a man who considered gossip a professional courtesy, was that Avery's ribs were healing on schedule, that her psychological evaluation had gone about as well as anyone could expect for a woman who had spent the last month proving she was constitutionally incapable of sitting still, and that Colonel Hale had personally recommended her for a commendation that was currently working its way through channels slower than either of them would have liked. Brooks was midway through a routine perimeter check on a Tuesday evening, thinking about nothing more complicated than the sunset bleeding orange across the western ridgeline, when his radio crackled with a voice he hadn't expected to hear that day. "Perimeter 2, you got a minute?" He recognized Miller's tone, immediately casual, but with an undercurrent of something he couldn't quite place. "Depends what for." "Someone at the main gate's asking for you by name. Says she doesn't have clearance." Brooks felt something in his chest lift before his brain had even fully processed who it had to be. "On my way." He found her standing just outside the checkpoint, out of uniform, for the first time since he'd met her, dressed simply in jeans and a jacket that did nothing to hide the careful, guarded way she still held her ribs when she moved. She looked lighter somehow, not just physically, though there was color back in her face that hadn't been there the night he'd first seen her collapsed against a fuselage, but lighter in some way that was harder to name, like a weight she'd been carrying long before that mission had finally partially set itself down. "You're not authorized to be here," Brooks said, deadpan, walking up to the gate. Avery raised an eyebrow, the faintest smile tugging at her mouth. "That joke's not as funny as you think it is." "I think it's hilarious." "You would." The gate guard, clearly briefed and clearly amused, waved them both through without further comment, and Brooks fell into step beside her as they walked toward the edge of the flight line, the same stretch of tarmac where everything between them had started. "Cleared for full duty yet?" he asked. "2 more weeks," she said. "Doctors are being cautious. Command's being more cautious. I think half of Hale's staff still isn't sure whether to treat me like a hero or a liability. Can it be both?" "Apparently that's exactly what everyone's struggling with," Avery said, a note of dry humor in her voice that Brooks was quickly learning was her default setting whenever something actually mattered to her. "Turns out the paperwork doesn't have a box for reckless but correct." Brooks laughed, surprising himself with how easily it came. "Sounds like most of the interesting people I've ever met." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the base settling into its evening rhythm. Around them, pilots heading toward the mess hall. After a routine training rotation, ground crews wrapping up final checks before shift change. The ordinary, unremarkable hum of a place that had weeks earlier held its breath for an hour, that neither of them would ever fully explain to anyone who hadn't lived through it. "I actually came to tell you something," Avery said eventually, her tone shifting, growing more deliberate. "That sounds ominous." "It's not, I promise." She stopped walking, turning to face him fully, something almost nervous in the set of her shoulders that felt strange coming from someone who'd once talked her way onto a live combat aircraft through sheer force of will. "Timber 6's commanding officer reached out to me last week. Wanted to thank me personally. Said some of his men wanted to do the same." "That's good, right?" "It's more than good," she said. I don't really have the right word for it. I've flown a lot of missions, Ethan. I've supported a lot of units, but I've never actually met the people on the other end of the radio before. Never had faces to go with the call signs. And now you do." She nodded, something visibly emotional passing behind her eyes before she blinked it back. The same practice control he remembered from the flight line that night. "They're doing a small ceremony next month. Nothing official, nothing Command's even sanctioning, really just the unit wanting to say thank you properly in person. Their CO asked if I'd come." She paused. "He also asked if the staff sergeant who let me onto that flight line might want to be there too." Brooks felt something catch in his throat. "Me." "You," Avery confirmed. Apparently the story made it back to them in more detail than either of us probably would have liked, and from what their CO told me, most of them don't just want to thank the pilot who flew the mission. They want to thank the guy who almost stopped her and chose not to at exactly the moment it mattered. Brooks stood there for a long moment, absorbing that feeling. The weight of it settled somewhere deep in his chest. Not the discomfort of unwanted attention, but something closer to a strange, humbling gratitude that people he'd never met, men whose lives he'd only ever heard about through strained radio transmissions in the middle of a chaotic night, wanted to look him in the eye and say thank you for a decision he'd made in less than 4 minutes with no time to be certain of anything. "I don't know what to say to that," he admitted. "You don't have to say anything yet," Avery said. "Just think about it. It's not for a few weeks." "I'll think about it," Brooks said. "I mean that, I will." They resumed walking, and for a while neither of them said much. The silence comfortable in the particular way silence became comfortable between two people who had already survived the hardest version of getting to know each other and didn't feel the need to fill every quiet moment with conversation just for the sake of it. "Can I ask you something?" Brooks said eventually. "Depends on the something," Avery said, echoing the exact words she'd used weeks earlier in the corridor outside the debrief room. "That night, when you first saw me coming toward you, gun hand ready, yelling at you to get away from the aircraft, what were you actually thinking? Not the version you gave command, the real version." Avery was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the same careful precision she seemed to bring to everything she said out loud. "Honestly," she said finally, "I was thinking that if you shot first and asked questions later, at least Nighthawk would still be sitting there when someone eventually figured out the truth. I wasn't scared for myself exactly. I was scared that I'd bleed out on that tarmac before anyone realized what was actually happening 70 miles north." Brooks felt something cold settle in his stomach at that admission. The reality of how close things had actually come hitting him freshly, weeks removed from the adrenaline of the moment itself. "I could have shot you." "You could have," Avery agreed simply. "You didn't. I think some part of me trusted that you wouldn't even before I had any real reason to. You didn't draw on me the second you saw me. You gave me a chance to explain even when every instinct you had was telling you not to. That matters more than you probably realize." It didn't feel like giving you a chance, Brooks admitted. It felt like hesitating when I shouldn't have. Maybe, Avery said, or maybe it felt like hesitating because some part of you was already picking up on things your training hadn't taught you how to name yet. The way I wasn't acting like someone dangerous. The way I wasn't acting like someone lost. You clocked something was different about the situation before you had the words for it. That's not weakness, Ethan. That's instinct doing exactly what it's supposed to do underneath all the training. Brooks turned that over for a long moment, watching the last of the sunset bleed out over the ridgeline, the sky shifting slowly from orange to a deep settling blue. You give people a lot of credit. I give people the credit they've earned, Avery said. You earned it. Twice actually, once for hesitating that night and again for showing up here right now to actually think seriously about coming to that ceremony instead of brushing it off. I haven't said yes yet. You will, Avery said with the same quiet, unshakable certainty that had once convinced an entire command structure to override medical protocol in the middle of a crisis. I've gotten pretty good at reading people who are trying to talk themselves into doing the right thing. You're already there, you just haven't said it out loud yet. Brooks laughed despite himself shaking his head. Is this what it's like being around you all the time, getting read like an open book? Ask Miller. Avery said, a genuine grin breaking through now. He'll tell you it's exhausting. They reached the edge of the flight line where NIGHTHAWK sat under the floodlights, fully repaired, now fully cleared, looking almost peaceful in a way it hadn't the last time Brooks had stood this close to it, no longer the center of chaos and crisis. Just an aircraft resting between missions, waiting for whatever came next. Avery's gaze lingered on it for a long moment, something complicated passing across her face. Pride certainly, but also something quieter, more private. The particular ache of someone looking at the thing that had nearly cost her everything and understanding with total clarity that she'd choose exactly the same path again without hesitation. You miss it, Brooks said. It wasn't a question. Every single day, Avery admitted. 2 more weeks feels like an eternity right now. And after that I fly again, she said simply. Different mission, different quarter, probably a whole new set of problems nobody's briefed me on yet. That's the job. It doesn't get easier because one mission almost broke me. It just means I go back up there a little more, aware of exactly what it costs. Brooks studied her for a moment, something settling into place in his understanding of her that he suspected had been building since the very first night, even when he hadn't had the language for it yet. You're not scared of going back up. I am scared, Avery corrected gently. I told you that back at the debrief. I'm always scared, but I've made peace with the fact that the fear doesn't get a vote in whether I go. It just gets to come along and remind me why the job matters in the first place. That's a strange kind of peace. Most useful kinds of peace are strange, Avery said. The comfortable kind rarely holds up under pressure. They stood there together for a while longer, watching the floodlights hum to life across the flight line as the last of the daylight finally disappeared, the base settling fully into its nighttime rhythm, quieter now, steadier. None of the chaos that had defined the last time they'd stood in roughly this same spot together. For what it's worth, Brooks said eventually, I think you should be proud of what happened that night. Not just the mission, all of it, the decision to come back, the decision to trust me with the truth instead of a lie, the way you flew that corridor like you'd memorized every inch of it because you had. That's not luck, Avery. That's something you built piece by piece long before any of us knew your name. Something shifted in her expression at that softer than anything he'd seen from her, before the careful composure she carried like armor, easing just slightly at the edges. That might be the nicest thing anyone said to me since this whole thing started. Don't get used to it, Brooks said, a small smile tugging at his mouth. I've got a reputation for being difficult to impress. I remember, Avery said dryly, you tried to arrest me. In my defense, you were standing next to a fully armed fighter jet during a combat scramble, with no ID, and a suspicious amount of blood on your shirt. Fair point, she conceded. Laughing a real laugh this time, unguarded, the kind Brooks hadn't heard from her even during the debrief, when the worst of the tension had finally lifted. I probably would have arrested me too. See, that's the thing, Brooks said. I don't think you would have. I think you would have asked questions first. I think that's exactly why Command trusted you with that radio in the first place, and exactly why they should keep trusting you every single time This job asks something impossible of you. Avery didn't respond right away, and when Brooks glanced over, he saw her jaw working slightly, the particular effort of someone fighting to hold something back that clearly wanted to surface. You know, she said finally, voice quieter now. 11 days before that mission, before any of this happened, I watched two men from Timber 6 go down on an open channel, and there was nothing I could do about it in that moment except keep flying and keep listening and hope like hell they made it. I carried that with me every single day in recovery. Every single day, Ethan. And then that broadcast came through, and for the first time in 11 days, I finally had a chance to actually do something instead of just carrying the weight of what I couldn't change. She paused, blinking hard, composure cracking just slightly at the edges. So when people ask me if I'm proud of that night, the honest answer is that pride isn't really the word for it. It's more like relief. Relief that I got a second chance to make it right. Brooks didn't say anything for a long moment, letting the weight of that settle between them, understanding now more fully than he had before exactly what had driven her that night. Not recklessness, not heroics for their own sake, but something rawer and more human. The specific unbearable need to finish something that had been left unfinished, to close a wound that had been left open for 11 long days. For what it's worth, he said finally, I think you did make it right, all the way right. 12 men went home because of what you did that night. That's not a small thing, Avery. That's not something you have to carry alone anymore. She looked at him, then something raw and grateful passing across her face before she managed to blink it back into something steadier. Thank you, she said quietly, for saying that, and for meaning it. I mean it, Brooks confirmed. They stood there a while longer in comfortable silence, the floodlights humming steadily above them, the bass breathing its quiet nighttime rhythm all around until Avery finally checked her watch and let out a small reluctant sigh. I should head back before my ride gives up on me, she said. 2 weeks until you're cleared, Brooks said. You excited? Terrified, Avery corrected, though there was genuine warmth in it now. None of the raw exhaustion that had colored every word she'd said that first impossible night. But the good kind of terrified, the kind that means something actually matters. I think I understand that kind now, Brooks said. Didn't before that night. Do now. Avery smiled, and this time it reached all the way to her eyes, unguarded and easy in a way that felt like it belonged to someone who had finally set down a weight she'd been carrying far longer than anyone around her had ever fully understood. Good, she said. That means the whole thing was worth it, even the parts that scared the hell out of both of us. Especially those parts, Brooks said. She turned to walk back toward the gate, then paused, glancing back at him one final time. The ceremony next month, she said. Say yes. Those men deserve to look you in the eye and say thank you properly, not just hear about you secondhand from a story that keeps growing a little more dramatic every time somebody retells it. Brooks laughed at that, the sound easy and unguarded in a way it hadn't been in weeks. Yeah, he said. Yeah, all right, I'll be there. Good, Avery said, satisfaction clear in her voice. I'll hold you to it. She walked back toward the checkpoint, moving with a steadiness that hadn't been there weeks earlier, favoring her ribs only slightly. Now the visible fragility of that first impossible night replaced by something sturdier, something that looked a lot like a person who had faced the worst version of herself and come out the other side more certain of who she was, not less. Brooks stood on the flight line long after she disappeared through the gate, looking out at NIGHTHAWK, sitting quiet under the floodlights, thinking about everything that had happened in the space of one impossible night, and everything that had unfolded quietly in the weeks since the debrief, the reclassification, the slow, careful process of two people rebuilding trust in a system that had nearly failed them both, and finding somewhere in that rebuilding something neither of them had expected to find at all. A month later, standing in a modest community hall, 2 states away, surrounded by 12 men and their families who wanted nothing more than to shake his hand and say thank you for 4 minutes of hesitation that had ended up mattering more than he ever could have imagined, Brooks finally understood the full shape of what that night had actually been. It hadn't been a security breach. It hadn't been a broken chain of command or a reckless pilot or a security officer who almost got it wrong. It had been 2 people doing their jobs exactly right in a moment that demanded something. The manuals never quite managed to teach the willingness to listen past the fear, to trust the truth even when it arrived wearing the wrong uniform, to bend just far enough, just in time to let the right thing happen, instead of merely the permitted thing. Avery stood beside him that afternoon, healed now cleared for full duty just 3 days earlier, watching the same soldiers she'd fought to save shake hands with the man who'd almost stopped her from doing it. And when their eyes met across that crowded room full of grateful families and quiet, overwhelming relief, Brooks understood with total clarity that some nights didn't just test a person. Some nights built them into something better than they'd been before. And somewhere out past the edge of that community hall, 70 miles from a canyon corridor that had once nearly claimed 12 lives and one impossible pilot alongside them, an aircraft named NIGHTHAWK sat quiet on a runway, fully repaired, fully ready, waiting for the next mission that would need exactly the kind of person willing to fly straight into danger for people she'd never even met. Because that, in the end, was never really about protocol or permission, or the roster that had almost failed to recognize her. It was about being real in a system that occasionally forgot how to see it until someone stood their ground long enough to prove it couldn't be ignored. And on that particular afternoon, surrounded by the very people whose lives had once depended entirely on that truth, nobody in that room needed convincing anymore. They already knew exactly who she was.